In February 1957, Buckingham Palace did something it was built to avoid. It answered a rumor. A single sentence was pushed into public view. It is quite untrue that there is any rift between the Queen and the Duke. That line matters because Buckingham Palace was not built to explain itself. Its old instinct was distance, restraint, silence. The code was often summarized as never complain, never explain. Do not dignify gossip, do not feed the press, and do not let the private life of the crown become a public argument. One piece of paper broke that pattern. So the denial did not end the story. It exposed the pressure behind it. Not evidence that Prince Philip had been unfaithful, not evidence that every whispered story was true. A headline can prove pressure. It cannot by itself prove what happened behind palace walls. What the 1957 denial proves is narrower and more revealing. By that moment, the idea of a rift between Elizabeth and Philip had become dangerous enough for the palace to confront in public. Now the rumor was no longer just private damage. It was a crown problem, not a confession, not a list of alleged lovers. A single sentence from Buckingham Palace trying to protect the image of stability around a young queen, her husband, and the crown they carried together. For the monarchy, the threat was not only what may or may not have happened in private, the threat was the public picture. The Queen at the center of the nation, the Duke beside her, and newspapers asking whether the marriage itself was unstable. So the sharper question is not simply, were the rumors true? It is why this rumor, at this moment, forced an institution of silence to speak. To answer that, the story has to leave the paper and move to the man named inside it, Prince Philip, the Duke beside the Queen, whose public role was becoming more constrained just as the palace needed him to look steady. Before Elizabeth became queen, Philip was not simply a royal husband in uniform. He was a naval officer, used to command, movement, hierarchy, and a life built around action. Then Elizabeth became sovereign, and the center of gravity moved away from him. The change did not just make Philip more visible, it made him secondary by design. In public, the Queen came first. In protocol, his position existed in relation to her office. Even the family name became sensitive. Mountbatten carried Philip's identity, while Windsor carried the continuity of the crown. Inside a monarchy, names and rank are not small details. They signal who holds power, whose line continues, and what must be protected. This tension does not prove betrayal. Frustration is not evidence, but it made every escape from ceremony easier to read as a clue. But it helps explain why Philip's movements outside the formal court attracted attention. Social circles associated with the Thursday Club offered a world very different from palace ceremony. Male company, jokes, dinners, informality, rooms where he was not defined only as the man walking behind the Queen. The club did not prove misconduct. It gave rumor a physical room to inhabit. By the mid-1950s, Philip's reputation was forming in the gap between two identities, the officer trained for command and the consort required to embody support. That gap mattered because the crown needed him to appear loyal, settled, and useful beside a young queen. The more constrained his official role looked, the easier it became for outsiders to read every private escape as a clue. So before the crisis became international, the pressure was already in place. A husband whose autonomy had narrowed, a court anxious about status, and a marriage expected to carry the image of national stability. Then Philip left Britain for months aboard the royal yacht Britannia. The private tension now had a route, a timetable, and a watching press. In late 1956, the royal yacht Britannia sailed as a symbol of confidence. Philip would represent the crown overseas, moving from port to port under the Union Jack. At home, Elizabeth remained the young queen, carrying the visible burden of monarchy without her husband beside her. Distance gave the rumor a timetable. Each port made absence visible again. A dinner in London could fade into gossip. A husband away for months, surrounded by aides, photographed abroad, and watched by foreign newspapers, became a story that could travel faster than the ship itself. Then the atmosphere acquired a name journalists could print: Commander Mike Parker. Parker was Philip's private secretary, a close friend from his naval world, and part of the masculine circle already drawing attention. During the Britannia tour, Parker's own marriage became a public problem. His wife began divorce proceedings, and Parker eventually resigned from Philip's household. That was not proof of anything about Philip's marriage. Parker's divorce belonged to Parker. But for the press, proximity was enough to sharpen the picture. The Duke was away, his closest aide was caught in a divorce scandal, and foreign outlets were more willing than the deferential British press climate to print speculation about the royal marriage. Those headlines were evidence of pressure, not evidence of affairs. Still, they created a damaging image. The Queen at home, the Duke overseas, a trusted aide resigning, and international newspapers asking whether the royal marriage itself was in trouble. By early 1957, Buckingham Palace was no longer facing scattered whispers. It was facing Philip's absence, Parker's resignation, and a press story it could not fully contain. The denial now looks less like a strange interruption and more like a threshold. The palace spoke not because the rumors had been proven, but because the appearance of a rift had become politically dangerous. Once the press began naming women around Philip, the next question was unavoidable. What did the rumor machine actually have? When women were named around Philip, the evidence did not sharpen, it splintered. One of the most repeated names was Pat Kirkwood, a celebrated stage performer. The documented core is narrow. In 1948, she met Philip, they danced. Kirkwood later denied that there had been an affair. Her denial matters because it belongs to the record. A meeting does not make a relationship, a dance does not prove betrayal, and a denial should not be treated as decoration in a scandal story. Once Kirkwood's name entered the royal rumor cycle, it stuck. The allegation followed her public life, attaching her to a story she could not fully control. For the press, the question itself remained usable even when the proof did not grow stronger. Decades later, a very different name appeared in Philip's story: Penny Knatchbull, Countess Mountbatten of Burma. The evidence around Knatchbull is different. This was a long, visible friendship rather than a single theater world encounter. She was known as a close companion of Philip in later life, within the accepted orbit of the royal family, and someone who shared interests with him. Her presence at Philip's funeral in 2021 drew attention because pandemic restrictions meant only 30 mourners could attend. That fact shows closeness, trust, and a place inside a very small circle at the end of his life. It does not by itself prove a physical affair. An honest account cannot become a list of confirmed lovers. What exists is a set of different evidence types: a documented meeting, a denied allegation, a long friendship, reported rumor, public proximity, and no conclusive proof of the alleged physical relationships. That unevenness created the palace's problem. The evidence was too uncertain to settle publicly, yet the uncertainty was strong enough to shape perception. Rumor did not need certainty to become dangerous. Proximity, repetition, and a royal marriage already under scrutiny were enough. Elizabeth's silence, then, cannot be read simply as helpless endurance. It has to be read as containment. Return to the 1957 statement, and it looks less like an explanation than a boundary. Buckingham Palace did not say every rumor was false. It did not name the women in the stories. It did not invite the press into a public trial of Philip's private life. It answered one claim, that there was a rift between the Queen and the Duke. That was the claim most dangerous to the crown. A rumored affair was damaging, but hard to prove and hard to deny without giving it more life. A broken royal marriage was different. It threatened the public image of the monarchy itself, the young queen, her consort, the family, and the constitutional stage on which they appeared together. So the palace spoke once, only where the threat was most political. Then came the visible adjustment. Shortly after the 1957 crisis, Philip was granted the title Prince of the United Kingdom. That should not be reduced to one cause. The status questions around Philip had existed for years: rank, role, family name, and his place beside a reigning queen. But in the aftermath of the press storm, the elevation did something practical. It strengthened the public position of the man whose restlessness and social world had become attached to rumor. It made him appear less like an unsettled husband at the edge of the institution, and more like a formally secured figure within it. That pattern changes the meaning of Elizabeth's silence. Silence did not mean nothing happened. It meant the palace chose the narrow denial. It refused to debate allegations it could not control. It repaired public status where status could be repaired. It kept the queen composed in front of cameras because visible emotion would only feed the story. The queen did not need to prove or disprove every rumor. Institutionally, she needed to stop rumor from defining the crown. That was the response: a narrow denial, a repaired public role, and containment. And if containment preserved the public marriage, it left a harder question behind. What kind of private truth disappears when silence becomes the shield? By the end of Philip's life, the public image had shifted from crisis to endurance. The young queen and the restless naval officer became an elderly couple, photographed together through jubilees, ceremonies, family upheavals, and the slow passing of a century. Whatever strains existed behind palace walls, the public partnership held. It became one of the central images of Elizabeth's reign. Not a marriage explained to the public, but a marriage presented as duty, continuity, and shared service. That endurance matters. It still leaves the central questions locked away. The available evidence still does not conclusively prove the alleged affairs as confirmed physical relationships. What it proves more clearly is the force of rumor itself, how one dance could shadow Pat Kirkwood for decades, and how later a documented close companion like Penny Knatchbull could be accepted within royal proximity without the palace turning that closeness into a public explanation. The palace shield protected the center. The people at the edges carried more of the weight. Elizabeth's silence preserved the institution because it made private truth inaccessible. The palace could not make every rumor disappear. It could make them unanswerable. It could deny the rift, maintain the appearances, repair status, and let time do what official statements could not. So the final story is not a list of confirmed lovers. It is a record of uncertainty, managed in public view, behind a gate that rarely opened. In February 1957, Buckingham Palace broke its rule of silence to say there was no rift between the Queen and the Duke. Decades later, that sentence still stands like a closed gate, clear in what it denies, silent about what it refuses to reveal. And in that silence, the crown survived. If you want more carefully sourced stories of power, image, and secrecy inside the monarchy, you're watching Palace Scandals.